I put myself here. Yeah, he's interesting. I heard the one on.
How did all these people get in my room? Thank you for coming. My name is. Thank you for coming to.
Right on cue.
As part of my lecture, asking everybody, please turn off or mute your iPhones.
Yep, it was a setup. I was
Helping you.
helping you.
I'm Vincent Rossi, coordinator of the Rancho Bernardo Historical Society Speaker Series. Happy to welcome you to today's edition of our speaker series. And I just want to briefly remind you that our next program, which will be September 9th, will be a unique program called San Diego County History Through Music, featuring Many Strings, which is the collaboration of Chris and Jamie Burns. Jamie Burns on dulcimer, Chris on keyboard. And they do a musical program of music incorporating from indigenous songs to songs of the Spanish and Mexican and then American periods. So history of music. So mark that down on the calendars. Okay, I told you about the cell phones. And we're happy today to welcome Tom Deméré, who's the Curator of Paleontology at the San Diego Museum of Natural History. We welcomed him a few years ago in 2018 to talk about fossil findings in the Silvergate area. And today he's going to discuss the 130,000-year-old Cerutti Mastodon site, which I'm looking forward to, and I know you all are too. So permit me to welcome Tom. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's another beautiful day in paradise, isn't it? Gosh, we're so fortunate. So it's my pleasure to talk to you about a very interesting site that we feel is rather compelling evidence that some species of Homo made it to the New World earlier than we thought. So it's a site that we call the Cerutti Mastodon site, and we'll learn more about it as we go along. So this is a big question. When did humans, members of the genus Homo, when did humans first disperse into the New World from the Old World? And this is from a paper published in Science in 2017 showing the dates, the generally accepted dates for the earliest sites in the Americas. So we have 14,000 here, 14,000 Paisley Cave in Oregon, the Santa Rosa Island, 13,000. Some sites over here in the eastern U.S., the Page Langston site at 14,000. There's some sites in South America, 13,000, and Monteverde at 14,500. So these are the generally accepted. When I say generally accepted, accepted by the archaeological establishment. And I'm a paleontologist, thank goodness. Archaeology is a very emotional science. And that's a biased statement, perhaps. But recently, you probably heard White Sands, New Mexico, a site dated between 21,000 and 23,000. Pretty interesting site. I'll talk about that in just a second. There's another site here in southern New Mexico. It's a rock shelter site with artifacts that are found in layers that have been dated at about 33,500. The dots are in red because they're not generally accepted by the archaeological establishment, as we'll find. And more recently, a site that was excavated by a colleague of mine on his own property in New Mexico at 37,500. It's a mammoth kill site. It's very compelling circumstantial evidence that humans were involved in the butchering of these mammoths and mother calf pair. And then we have the Cerutti Mastodon site with a big number, 130,000 years before present. So if you think of these dates at 14,000, 13,000, it's just a zero. Just a order of magnitude much larger. So this is our site, the Cerutti Mastodon site. You can see why that caused quite an uproar when we published this, the results of our study in the journal Nature back in 2017. So I mentioned the White Sands, New Mexico site. This is a very interesting site because there's human footprints. in sediments that again dated between 21,000 and 23,000 years before present. And the human footprints occur in the same deposits and on the same trackways as giant ground sloth trackways, camels, and mammoths or mastodons. So again, this site is about, let's say, about 33,000 at the oldest. And then this is that the Hartley mammoth site in northern New Mexico that's been dated at about 38,000 to 36,000. Again, these three sites are not generally accepted by the archaeological establishment. And then we have the Cerutti Mastodon site. Again, we published this in the British journal Nature in 2017. And it was an interesting couple of weeks when this when the news broke about this site. We had a lot of interesting reactions from the archaeological establishment. And the dates here are about 130,000 plus or minus 9 and 10,000 years. So between 140 and 120,000 years old. Obviously a very different site. So I want to talk about the Cerutti Mastodon. We originally excavated this site in the El Nino winter of 1992 and 93. So quite a few years ago. In fact, it was about 25 years to the day that we published our results of this study that began in 1992. So this is the South Bay Freeway, State Route 54, down between National City, or Bonita and National City, east of the 805. And I'm showing you, here's the 805, there's the South Bay Freeway. Bonita sits here. And so this is during construction. And our site is here on the north side. We were monitoring the excavation activities, which is what we do routinely at the museum. We're out in the field almost every day of the year, like weekday of the year, on some construction site here in Southern California, looking for and hopefully finding fossils and getting them out of the way of the scrapers and bulldozers. So this is where the site was. Caltrans has added new travel lanes. In the process, they were cutting back a hill that was composed of Ice Age sediments, Pleistocene sediments that are, again, 130,000 years old. So this is a construction map in map view, and these are homes, so it gives you a sense of scale. So this is a development on the north side of the freeway. These lines here are contour lines, so lines of equal elevation. So this is a hilltop up here going down into a low area. These are the original travel lanes. This is our site here. And then this is a construction map of what's the improvement. So they're adding an off-ramp here for the new travel lanes westbound. And in the process, they cut that hill back and they created this, it's odd looking here, but this is a berm they sculpted out of the sediment. I'll show you. They also put a storm drain in here, which and the construction drawings provided a really nice cross-section of what we're talking about. So this is the original ground level here to the south. This is the north side of it. So the homes are sitting over here. And this cut slope was made in 1970 when they built the homes on the north side of the freeway. And then this is the new land surface that was the construction crew graded. So the new travel lanes were placed here. In the process, all of this material between the blue line and the green and red line was removed and used elsewhere in the freeway construction for fill and to build buttresses and overcrossings and things like that. So this is the old cut slope here on the north side. This is the new cut slope. And here's a close-up view of that. So here's the new landform again. So all of this was taken out, but this is all undisturbed sediment. Look at that a little bit more. And this is the bed, the geologic layer that contained the Cerutti Mastodon. And so you can see back here, when they moved the slope from toe slope from here to there, they cut into and exposed the layer that contained the Mastodon remains. And that's how we found the site. But our excavation went all the way back into here. So this was all done by hand. This has been disturbed by at least part of the bed, the fossil was in was disturbed by the equipment, and that's how it was discovered. There's a big proof of ivory that Richard Cerutti, our field paleontologist on this site, and the person who the site is named after. So this is looking at it the day after it was discovered. So the original toe slope is here. You can see the backyard of the house right north of it. And this is the new toe slope. So that slope's coming down here. You can see it back here. So all this rubble is where the excavator, there was a big backhoe, had raked across and removed sediment from above the bone bed and down into the bone bed. But it left the bottom part of the bone bed and removed the top part. I hope that's not too complicated. So the layers here, and it didn't take the whole layer out, it took out half of it, and that's how Richard said, "Stop! Stop, I see something." Fortunately, it's a big construction site, so they were able to work all over the place to leave us this spot to work and but first to explore. So the first thing we did, we removed all this disturbed material and swept the area clean so that we're down into undisturbed material, but it had been tagged by the excavator. But again, we eventually dug into the slope. So that's the area of disturbance. And this is another view looking west. There's the backyard. This is later on in the excavation. Again, I mentioned it was an El Nino winter. So we had to cover the site a few times as it flooded. But you can see the slope that was cut by the excavators, the top of the slope, and then the top of the berm, and then it went down to the freeway. This gives you a sense of the setting. So originally the slope was there, it was cut back to here, and then we ended up cutting into here. So just a few photos of that. One corner, the extreme northeastern corner of where we excavated. The excavator had removed the entire bone bed. So this is one of the tusks here. That's the other tusk. We'll talk about that in a minute. And these gouge marks are where the teeth on the end of the bucket scraped across. So this is all undisturbed except for being tagged. So again, we swept it clean so we were all down to fresh material. And this is what we ended up with. We'll talk a little bit more about this. But each of these squares is 1 meter on a side. Over time, we excavated 50 square meters of bone bed, which is about 540 square feet. So I don't know how big this room is, but similar. And so here's the original Toa slope. Here's the new Toa slope. And this is the area that was completely removed of the bone bed. But this area had been tagged, but still, all of this material is still in place. And again, then this was all handed up. Now, I belabor this point because I want people to understand that large portions of this excavation that we did were in pristine, undisturbed material. So it's not like what we found here was disturbed by the equipment. So here's just some photographs of the excavation. Here's Richard Cerutti. Unfortunately, Richard passed away 2 years ago. But this photo was taken in January 20 of 1993. So this is the original toe slope was about where the new toe slope was about where Richard's knee is. So this was all dug by hand. And this is the new couple of other units. So we dug it in square holes, going down a level at a time to document what we were finding and to photograph and plot. So you can see the distribution of our objects here, and we'll talk more about those in a moment. But this is just a close-up of one of the areas that had been disturbed, but we had swept it clean. So this is a cobble sitting in this fine grained matrix. We'll talk more about that, but these photos give you a sense of what the site looked like as it was being excavated. This is looking down on one of the units. Again, this is the corner of one of these 1 meter square units. There's a rib of a mastodon, a tailbird of a mastodon, in place as the site was deposited 130,000 years ago, and preserved for us to open up again and explore and try to interpret. Another unit, again, the strings are marking the borders of a 1 meter square. Here's a cobble, here's a rib, mastodon rib, and a cobble in this crust that's on it is caliche. It's a soil carbonate that forms in soils with groundwater moving up and down and carrying elements of calcium carbonate that eventually precipitate out. So the fact that we have calcium carbonate out here shows that the object in here is old because it formed, the carbonate formed long after the sediments had been deposited. But preserving all the features, as you lift this off, any feature that we see on this rock was there before the calcium carbonate formed. So this is what we call a stratigraphic column because it summarizes the strata, the layers that we found. So this is 6 meters, about 20 feet. So that berm, or that area where the fossil was found, was cut by the excavator. These layers were found in that. And this area here is what's shown in this photograph. This is the back wall. This is the porous wall. One of those units that we excavated on this, 1 meter square units. And what we're looking at is a series of strata. These are cross-bedded sandstones that were deposited in a river channel. And overlying them are these fine grained silts that the Mastodon is found in. There we call it the E-bed. And then it's overlain by another fine grained unit. So this is an active channel. This is what's called an overbank. So the river floods. It flows out of its channel and flows over onto an area that's usually not accumulated sediment, and it's pretty quiet, so all the fine grained sediment ends up over on these overbank sediments, it's called. During flood stage, this is where cows end up, and automobiles that are rafting down the stream, and house parts. So anyway, so E-bed is the bed that we collected fossils out of. And this may be confused. This is a geologic map. Here's the Southwick Freeway. This is the 805 Freeway. Veneta sits down here. This is the Sweetwater River Valley. And these are some of the old river deposits that are associated with the Sweetwater River Valley over the last 130,000 years. And our site is on this very high terrace. This was actually part of the Sweetwater River drainage 130,000 years ago. Erosion, modern erosion, has made it more of an isolated patch. And the dating was done by Jim Paces at the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver, using a very fancy method of uranium series dating. It's a radiometric dating process. And the dates came back, again, 130,000 plus or minus 9. Between 120,000 and 140,000. For paleontologists, that's pretty good resolution. Radiocarbon dating, which is useful for objects that are less than 50,000 years, can get more precise dates. But when you get back into the realm of the age of these, the radiocarbon dating doesn't work. So, returning to our site, so again, 50 square meters of bone bed, that's north. So the objects on here are, the blue objects are bones of a single individual of an American mastodon. And a mastodon is an evolutionary cousin of a mammoth. And if it's a foggy day and you were squinting, they would both look the same, an elephant and a mastodon and a mammoth, with tusks and large body and straight legs. You wouldn't want them to step on you. So the blue are bones of American mastodon. The golden objects are teeth, so tusks. One tusk here, one tusk there. We'll talk more about that. And then some molars here and there. And then the green objects are rocks, cobbles of metavolcanic composition. And the red rocks here and over here are rocks, cobbles of granitic composition. And so that's the distribution. So you think of this as a CSI, a crime scene investigation. You have the evidence laid out. You have the body here with the chalked outline of the body. You have shell casings over there. Maybe some blood spatter here. And you're trying to look at gather all the evidence so that you can interpret the events that resulted in the pattern that you see. So there's an interesting pattern here that we'll explore now as we go through this. First of all, you see some concentration here, there's some concentration here, and then there's some real scatter. You see some big bones and a lot of little bones, and these are all blue pieces of bone. And you see some rocks, but just a few rocks. And they're kind of scattered, although some are associated with these bone concentrations. Of course, then we see that. We'll come back to that. That's pretty interesting. So this is a parts map for an American mastodon. And what we're trying to do is summarize what we found at the site. So we found parts of both tusks. We found a couple of molars, a little bit of the skull here, some vertebrae, just a few, one in the upper back, one in the middle back, and then we had one down here in the tail. And then we had the heads of both femurs, which is interesting, and some pieces of the shaft of the femurs, and then a couple of bones in the left forelimb or left hand and foot. So most of it's missing. So anyway, I want to go through the results, what we call kind of the surprising anomalies of the site. So we had those 5 large cobbles that I mentioned, and they range in size. The largest weighs about 30 pounds, 12 to 13 inches in diameter. So we have these large cobbles, but it's found in that very fine-grained sediment, which geologically kind of doesn't make sense. If you think of a current of water flowing, the faster it flows, the larger the objects that it can carry. There's a lot more energy. The slower it flows, only the fine sediments can be carried. So a really fine-grained deposit, say a silt or a clay layer, suggests that the velocity of the water carrying those particles was very slow. But yet we have these big cobbles, so it's hydrologically out of sync with one another to find these big cobbles like this in this fine-grained sediment. And not a bunch of them, but just a few in this case. In 50 square meters, we had 5. So that was a real puzzle when we first discovered this site. We were excavating. This is one of the cobbles here in one of these concentrations, surrounded by bones and stuff. And I mentioned that soil carbonate. It peels off, but this is caliche. It forms. It's also called hardpan. It forms in arid environments. Again, with the action of groundwater moving up and down in the soil horizon, depositing sediment. So here's one of those large cobbles. See the hand for scale. So these are the cobbles. This scale is 10 centimeters, and these are the weights in kilograms. You can just multiply by 2 to get pounds, roughly. So this is the shape of them, 3 dimensions. You see, paleontologists and geologists love rocks, so they take pictures of them and show them to everybody. So the other thing is, I already mentioned, there's 2 concentrations, so it's not like the material is just scattered across this area uniformly. Again, think of the CSI, it's the crime scene. So we have this concentration. The pattern is, these weird patterns suggest the process. And in a crime scene investigation, we want to take all the evidence into consideration and all the various patterns and see where's the sweet spot in your Venn diagram overlaps. So concentration, so this is we just referred to this as concentration 1 and this is concentration 2. So, and again, remember that this is all hand excavated from that line this way. And this was tagged but not moved by the excavator. So this is at concentration 1, so we have one of these metavolcanic rocks. Then we have the Mastodon middle backbone here. We have a tooth here encasing that soil carbonate. We have a couple of pieces of the shafts of femurs, but broken, sharply broken. We'll look at these in a minute too. And then we have the heads of both femurs. So think of this femur on its Mastodon. And they have 2 femora like we do, right and left, and they're found side by side, associated with a cobble. And there's actually pieces of pegmatite right here, or the granite rock right there. So we're looking at this concentration here. So we interpret these rocks as hammerstones and anvils. And just as the name implies, an anvil would be a platform, a hard platform, where you put an object and you take a hammerstone and hit the object that's sitting on that anvil. So obviously now we're interpreting what this pattern is suggests to us. And our interpretation is that those rocks were brought to the site to be used as tools. Archaeologists refer to those as maniports. It's like you're camping in the desert and you're setting your tent up and you're getting ready to put stakes in the ground and you go to the car and you forgot a hammer, right? So you're in the desert, which is good, and you look around for a rock, and it's a rock, you pick it up, you drive that stake into the ground, it's a tool, and then you throw the rock down and it's a rock again, but it might have use wear on it. So it's an expedient tool, not a manufactured tool. It's not flaked or anything, but it's been used for a purpose. So we have these rocks that we interpret as maniports brought to the site to be used as expedient tools. And then we also find these bone fragments. So we don't find complete bones. We don't find the femur for a American Mastodon is about 3 feet long, about this big around. Pretty heavy bone with really thick cortical layers, almost an inch thick. But this is what we find from the shafts of those femurs, these spirally fractured fragments of long bone. And I'm going to focus on this one. This was found in this concentration 1, sitting in this position right here. Here's that, what we interpret as an anvil stone. And this is a movie showing, well, we did photogrammetry of, here's the actual bone here, and here's a grayscale version of it, so you can kind of removes the color pattern so you can see more of the shape. And in this particular diagram, we simulated an anvil stone here and a hammerstone there, and the yellow is a point of percussion. And again, envision this bone being 3 feet long, and you can see the scale here. That's only 5 centimeters. So we'll put this in motion, hopefully. So you can see the shape of it. Here's the cortical side, the outside of it. And look how thick it is. And it has this, not a sharp break, but a spiral break. It's called a spiral fracture, and it's characteristic of bone that breaks while it's fresh. So if you're in a skiing accident, your foot plants and you turn like this, and your tibia breaks, it usually breaks with a spiral fracture. It spirals up the bone rather than across straight through the bone. So it's characteristic of green bone breakage, which means the bone is broken when it's fresh, not years later or after it weathered or anything like that. But again, so that's here in this concentration with an animal next to it. And this is another bone that was found quite distant from the main concentrations. It's also a piece of femur. Again, the same sort of thing. The colored version here and the grayscale version here. And again, look how thick that cortical bone is. I mean, it's about this thick. So this is not a true marrow cavity, but that's where the red blood cells would form. And again, yellow is where the point of percussion is. The violet color there is a flake scar. If you notice, this is thick here, this is thick there. And as you get over here, it thins, and that's because this bone was struck from above. And like a BB being shot through a window. The entry hole is small, and the exit hole is this big cone of damage. So you get, on one side, on the entry side, it's just a little hole. On the exit side, it's quite a big disc-shaped defect. So I'll put this in motion. So that's the inside, this is the external part of the bone. This was encased in carbonate too, which is what those cracks were on. and it's going to zoom in to the area of interest. And there's a little flake scar here that hasn't detached yet. Now it's going to tilt up. You can see how it tapers? That's the exit balloon. So here's the entrance balloon. You can see it's just half of the entrance. So if we had the other half of here, this would be a hole where the impact occurred. And then it unroofed that narrow cavity. Yes?
What would have caused that?
Good question. Being struck with a hammer, a rock. And then, of course, why would you do that?
Somebody was brave enough to do that. A person, I assume.
We'll see a modern example of that in a moment. So we have these bones that are fractured. So bone fragments with distinct breakage features on them. Green vein bone breakage, and also an indication of percussion. And but we also have missing portions of the long bones. So again, these bones are like 3 feet long, that big around. We only have pieces of it. The question is, where's the rest of it? That's part of the pattern. It's not only what's there, but what's not there. So again, thinking as a crime scene investigator, that's part of the pattern, what's going on. Our suggestion is that the bones were being broken deliberately to get tool-making material. Because humans have made bone tools for a long time, millions of years. So this is kind of a Home Depot. Where you get some raw material, take it elsewhere where you can be comfortable, and then you flake it down into tools.
And also maybe for the bone marrow.
Also for the bone marrow too. But the fact that there's pieces missing suggests that they're taking material with them. Because why isn't it there? Especially if it was broken for by.
If somebody broke the bones into pieces, could animals not, other predatory animals not have taken some of the
That's true.
pieces?
But then why break them in the first place? Because
Well,
it's kind of dangerous to break. Because you'll see.
they're not mutually exclusive.
Pardon me?
They're not mutually
No.
exclusive. Somebody could have broken them, and then animals could have taken the leftovers into pieces.
That's true. We don't see any evidence of gnawing on any of the bones. And carnivores or scavengers leave marks on bones and gnaw. But I hadn't thought of that they came back and, oh, look at all this stuff. But of course, then why are they going to take the bones with them unless they have meat still on them? But, there's no signs of butchery of this either. There's no signs that humans were trying to take meat on them. So again, here's a modern, not a modern mastodon, but a mastodon skeleton at the museum, and you can see how large that bone is, and really heavy. So this is the whole animal. Again, we only found parts of it. And it could be that that layer continues on. We didn't excavate the whole layer, so there's potential for more at that site for future workers. And then there's this question of purposeful placement. We talked about these heads of both femurs. How does that happen? Well, they're in the context of this concentration with an anvil stone in the middle. And if this was a processing station where they're breaking bones, that one green bone breakage that we saw, the first one is sitting right here. The one that had the nice spiral fracture on it. So it's possible this was an area where they were processing bone, pieces were falling off, the heads of both femurs, they just placed here. I mean, how does that happen? It's just such an odd pattern. We've excavated other mastodons. We've never found detached femur heads by themselves. The other thing is that we have this tusk. I've been mentioned several times. So this is the layer, and I mentioned that this is the area that unfortunately was totally removed. The bone-bearing layer was totally removed by the excavator. But we kept showing you that circle. The circle was the cross-section through the tusk, and it extended 60 centimeters down into the underlying layers. So here's a view of that again. So this is looking at a plan view at it. That's the tusk. You can see the layers of ivory. And it's a circle because it's sitting vertically. And here's one we're excavating. We went down 60 centimeters to get the tusk out. We didn't think it went that deep. In fact, we broke part of it digging down. we should have been more careful. What we don't know is how far it extended up, because it had been taken by the excavator. How does that happen? How does that happen in a natural process, geologic process? How does a tusk get inverted and stuck into the ground that deeper? Of course, the question is, well, how did it happen? And if humans were involved, why did they do that? Well, you'd have to ask them. Somebody suggested, well, you know, there was probably some teenage, and they just were showing off. Look what I've done, right? I don't know. It's really a puzzle. Again, as part of this crime scene pattern, it really needs to be looked at in its totality.
Or maybe a battle. There was another Mastodon in the area.
Another Mastodon that came over and stuck it in the ground.
No, but maybe it broke off and the accident.
Well, there are possible explanations like that, or the Mastodon fell face first, but the other tusk was not. It was laying on its side. So anyway, that was an interesting pattern. What we, in quotes, say was purposeful placement. And then there are these rock bone and molar refits that are separated by large distances. For instance, here, this is that concentration 1, and it's just showing rocks now. And this is that granite rock, and it's sitting over here, and almost 10 feet away are pieces that fit back on it. And those pieces happen to be in this area of these concentrations, these two here. And then there's some pieces up here that fit back together, and pieces of rock that fit back together here. And over here, there's a molar. One of the molars is half of it's over here, and this is concentration. The other half is over here, and there's one cusp in the middle. So it looks like this was being broken. This molar was being broken. And the enamel is pretty thick on a Mastodon molar, and these little micro chips can be used as scraping tools, I'm told. Again, I'm a paleontologist, I'm not a geologist. So we're going to focus on this one, this granite cobble here that has pieces there. So, and here's a and all been put back together. So this is the color version, this is the grayscale version. So they've been reunited virtually here, but this is how they were found. Again, this is about 10 feet. So we'll put this in motion. And it's just turning around, and this cobble, when it's all put back together, weighs about 30 pounds. 33 pounds. And it's going to roll up, and then it's going to come apart, and you'll see all the pieces. And those pieces were found here. Really sharp breaks. They're not abraded corners or anything. And so our hypothesis here is that this rock was a hammerstone. Its composition is different from all the other rocks we found. These green rocks are, again, metavolcanic, very tight rock, almost not a lot, tighter than an obsidian, metavolcanic rock. Whereas this is a granite rock, very coarse grained. It's actually a pegmatite. You know what a pegmatite is? Pegmatite is a type of granitic rock. It forms in veins and produces a lot of gem minerals like tourmalines and kunzite and a lot of really beautiful, in our backcountry here, a lot of our gem mine areas are in pegmatites. But anyway, it has really coarse crystals of feldspar. So anyway, we think that this rock was used as a hammerstone here, but it broke along the margins of these large crystals within it. So it was a poor choice. Somebody suggested that, so it was used here to break a bone, pieces fell off it because the rock broke itself, and maybe hit somebody in the head and it threw the rock over here. I don't know, but it's a really interesting pattern, but it broke, and we think it was being used here as a hammerstone, breaking bones in this location where all that bone was concentrated. And then there's use wear on rocks and striaton bones. I don't know if you can see these. This is a piece of bone here, and there's these parallel scratches on it. This is the bone here, and this is a piece of femur shaft. We suggest that it was sitting on an anvil, and when it was struck, it skidded across the anvil, and that caused these scratch marks on it. And this is a cobble that has a big flake scar on it here. The white here is that soil carbonate, that caliche I was talking about. So this was covered with caliche, and this flake scar was underneath that caliche, so it's an old feature. And then there's some secondary use there. And this is a disc-shaped cobble that we think is a hammer stone that was being used. The edge of it was being used as the point of percussion. And that's where the flake is. The flake came off this very edge. So we think it perhaps went through the bone and struck the anvil underneath. And then there's differential bone breakage. So we have these big, heavy bones. The femurs are broken, and then we have ribs and these neural spines and vertebrae that are unbroken. So in a geological setting, if you have high energy and you have bones of different strengths, so to speak, you would think that the weaker bones, the more fragile bones, the long bones, the ribs, and the neural spines would break before the femurs would break. But we have the opposite pattern, again, as part of this crime scene investigation. And then more recently, we had a study conducted by a French colleague looking at bone residue on some of our stones. And so these little circles are where they sampled to find, and they found on one side, this is that part of that pegmatite rock. And on the business end of it, there were traces of micro residue of Mastodon bone chips. And on the other side, the broken side, there were none. And we saw that on some of the other bones too, including some of the anvil rocks, and some of the anvils. The upside had bone residue on it, and the underside didn't, suggesting, at least fitting the pattern that these were used as expedient tools in the processing of the skeleton. And then we did some little experimental archaeology. I'll show you the video here. And I think there's audio, which we don't need. But see, here's an anvil stone, and here's a hammer stone. And that's the head of an elephant finger. So there's the shaft. And it's making this percussion mark circular. And it's resting on an anvil. And then it breaks through. Notice the hammer goes through and hits the anvil underneath. And flakes are flying off. So this is kind of a proof of concept sort of experiment. It's not rigorous, but you see it goes right through, breaks the bone, but it took some effort. And the weight of that cobble is about 30 pounds. So they were trying to simulate that. And you also notice it took at least 2 people. One person foolish enough to hold it. Until the person figure out what's going to happen. So anyway. This is the process we think that was utilized to create the crime scene that we have at this 130,000-year-old site. And then, just to show you some examples of bone tools, this is a bone hand axe from Olduvai, 1.5 million years. So it's a piece of elephant bone that's been flaked and to make a tool out of. This is one from Italy that has a little more creative flaking, but you can see the cancellous bone here and the cortical bone there. And it's kind of shaped into a hand axe. So elephant bone dated at about 350,000 years in the Mediterranean region. So again, we think this was a bone processing site to collect blanks, so to speak, blanks of bone that can be taken and used to crack a can to create tools. So, as an archaeological site, we think that the patterns are consistent, that this was a bone processing site. We have these anvils and hammerstones, which we think were vandyports brought to the site to be used as expedient tools. The bone debris around the anvils suggests that these were working, these spots where they were actually processing bone. There's the bone and stone refrits that fit this idea of a bone processing site, and this differential bone breakage, the fact that large pieces, or most of the pieces of his femurs are missing, suggests that they were taken away, spiral fractures and bone breakage. Obviously, we didn't find human remains. There's no cut marks on the bones. There's no modified for manufactured flake stones. So no clear stone artifacts.
Since apparently, based on the introduction, archaeologists have not accepted this as compelling enough evidence that humans go back 130,000 years ago, do they have an alternate explanation of what you've discovered?
Well,
That would involve something besides humans doing what you've described?
Yeah, so we have all this disparate evidence, right? You know, again, this crime scene. So what they do is they kind of pick one and say, well, the stones could have rolled down the hill. Yeah, I guess they could have, right? Except that I don't know where the hill was that they're rolling down. Or that the bones could be broken by trampling. So they pick the individual lines of it. They don't look at the totality of the evidence. The most outrageous is that all the stuff that we saw was created by equipment damage, that we didn't even know we were digging in a disturbed site. And the frustrating part too is that they're not interested in coming and looking at material. So that's really, and one of the critics is it's in Eagle State, but it's too far to drive to that. That's my side of the story, right?
Well, it's just unfortunate that there seems to be this competition. To me, the ideal thing is you take both expertise and you figure it out. Either you'd be right or they'd be right, but whatever, you each have some expertise to offer. To someone who's interested in the actual conclusion that cooperation apparently is not taking place.
And that's really what's been most surprising to me, is that the lack of curiosity, the act of just, well, let's see what the truth is. Well, you know, let's talk about this. Well, certainly that's possible, because one of the most common reactions to this is it's too old. The site is too old; it can't be an archaeological site. But then I have to say, well, that's not really an answer. Say it's too old. It's only too old because you think it's too old.
Well, Louis Leakey wouldn't agree with that. I mean, he's okay with 1.5 million.
So anyway, these are some of the other processes that are potential explanations. So fluvial transport, right? So this was all deposited by a stream. But there's no size sorting of bones. It's not like there's just big bones or just little bones. I mean, there's the whole size range is there. So it's not being size sorted by currents. And the fact that we have this differential breakage doesn't make sense. You know, why the heavy bones are broken and the others aren't. Doesn't explain why most of the femur, the shafts of the femur are missing. It doesn't explain the vertical tusk. And it doesn't explain the large cobbles and the fine sediment. So so we looked at all of these, like pre-burial trampling. Think about elephants. Living elephants like to visit the carcasses that they're fallen, and they pick them up and step and walk around them, and they have some affinity to their skeletal remains. It's really kind of amazing. But there's no evidence of trampling on these bones. And again, differential breakage. You think if they're stepping on bones, they're going to break the ribs and the vertebrae, and maybe at the end break a long bone. And there's no trample marks. And predator gnawing was suggested, but I'm trying to think of a predator big enough to break a Mastodon femur mid-shaft, and there aren't any. Nobody suggested Bigfoot was involved, but they also didn't suggest that space aliens did it. So.
How far away is the closest archaeological site that has human habitation from this site?
How far away is the closest accepted archaeological site?
Yeah.
That's old?
Well, it shows human. Well, yeah.
Well, the oldest. I think Richard Curator was here not too long ago talking about the Harris site, which is very cool. I think the oldest dates at the Harris site are about 11,000.
Okay.
Yes.
Well,
I'm thinking of something else, because you don't have evidence of butchery, you don't have evidence of gnawing. You've got basically clean bones. Could the animal have died and then after the organic matter disintegrated, humans, and I've got no problem with humans being here 130,000 years ago.
Sure. Devil's advocate.
Could they have come in after, basically all the flesh had disintegrated and just used the bones?
That is possible.
Yeah, you said it's a bone processing site, so they found the bones of a dead animal and then just, hey, look, we have bones, let's make some tools.
Right, well, I think that the carcass had probably decomposed.
That's what it was.
Yeah, because it's not, there's no connective tissue holding the bones, because there's no arrangement of bones that suggests that they were still held together by connective tissue. But it didn't weather long enough that the collagen was gone because they broke spirally. If they had been weathered for a long time, I don't know, it depends on the weather patterns, a year or more, the bones would show that they were weathered, and they wouldn't have broken spirally. They would have broken with straight, more straight fracture.
So they could have found an animal carcass, but it would have been within just a few years of the animal passing.
Or a few months. Again, it depends on what the climate was, what time of year. Because decomposition speeds up in the summer, I think, versus, I'm not a carcass expert.
Was this during an ice age?
Well, actually, it was coming out of an ice age. It's an interglacial period. So
Interglacial.
it was coming into a warm period, coming out of a cold period. So we'll talk about that in a minute. That's a good question. So the conclusion is that we think it was occupied for a short period of time and the bone processing site that it occurred 130,000 years ago. It's kind of, I've had several people say, well, if this was younger, there'd be no problem with the site. It's too old. Well, not this many. They also said, if this was in Europe or in Africa, nobody would have a problem with it. This is an archaeological site, literally. Even at that date, but it's here in the Americas. So it suggests a much older hominid presence in the Americas. And again, probably not human Homo sapiens, but some other species of Homo, maybe a late Homo erectus, or this mysterious group that's called the Denisovans that are only really known from a few scraps of bone that produce DNA that suggests it's very different. The genome is different from humans, modern humans. But it also suggests a failed dispersal of it, because we don't think these people were here and stayed. Because the genetics of Native Americans is clearly tied to the genetics of East Asia. But we think this is a group that's preceded that dispersal. And it poses a challenge that we need to look in rocks that are of appropriate age. Archaeologists dig, and when they get to 11,000 years or whatever, we're done, we're not going to dig any deeper. Where's the curiosity? So when did hominins disperse to the Americas? At the end of the last glacial maximum, which we've been talking about. So the Ice Age, we'll talk about. So the Ice Ages were actually more than one period of glaciation. But the last glacial maximum was actually about 20,000 years ago. But this is when the earliest accepted dates for humans in North America, 14,000. Or was it prior to the last glacial maximum? Or earlier, even. So at the end of the penultimate last glacial maximum. So there's a series of cycles of glaciation. So this is a glacial condition. This is ice sheets, the North American ice sheets here. You can see ice sheets in Northern Europe. There's a separate ice sheet here in Alaska. And this is the interglacial period. So if you go back and forth, glacial, interglacial, glacial. And just look at Florida and Baja California for a minute. So sea level falls in glacial conditions because all that water vapor is now here on land. And a couple miles thick of ice. Not just a little layer of ice, but a couple of miles thickness of ice. So this is the interglacial warm, which we're in today, and glacial, which we were in 20,000 years ago, the height of the last glacial maximum. So this is what's called oxygen isotope signature for the last 900,000 years, and it's a proxy for sea level. So that we're going back in time. This is today. That's 900,000. So glacial conditions are the saddles in this graph, and interglacial are the peaks. So you can see there's a whole series of these glacial interglacial cycles over the last 900,000 years. This is what defines what the geologists call the Pleistocene, which is synonymous with the Ice Age. But I would say ice ages, plural. And so this is the transition from the last glacial maximum to the current interglacial. And then we can see there's a whole series of them. And if we look at this scale, which is just this portion of the last 140,000 years. So this is the last glacial maximum are accepted to have crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia into Eurasia into North America. The glacial maximum is about here at 18 to 20,000. So this is just kind of going into the modern interglacial. And so here's our time period. We have the same conditions. We have glacial maximum here at 150, 140,000 years ago, going into an interglacial maximum of 125,000. Sea level is actually higher at that point in time than it is today. The sea floors that are now Pacific Beach and Kellogg Park in La Jolla, those are all, that was ocean level at that time. So these are some models produced. It's kind of a complicated figure, but this is showing sea level. So that's the glacial maximum. It's about a little under 140 meters, so it's about 450 feet, 420 feet below modern sea level at the height of the last last glacial. If you can imagine, drop sea level 400 feet, where the shoreline would be today. The continental shelf would be exposed. It's just amazing to think that this is the history of our planet. So, 24,000 years ago, again, this glacial maximum. I know the figures, I keep saying 18,000, 20,000, 20. Well, it's kind of a span for that last. But this is a model by a group in Australia, or it's New Zealand, I can't remember the name of it. This is shown in ice sheet, North America, Eurasia, Siberia, and the Bering Land Bridge. So sea level falls, the Bering Shelf is exposed. There's a passageway, but it's being blocked by this ice sheet. 10,000 years ago, sea levels recovered to about, now it's still below modern sea level, so about 30 meters from where it is today, maybe 100 feet. But the Bering Strait is starting to form. The land bridge is broken. Of course, today it's quite an expansive sea now across between Alaska and Asia. But at 13,000 years ago, it was the sweet spot, kind of the Goldilocks moment. So this is when it's hypothesized that humans dispersed into the New World. The problem with that, though, too, is some of the oldest dates are in Chile. They're going pretty fast. That's a long way. It's a long way to get to Chile by 14,000 years.
Take a boat. I mean, there's a lot of hypotheses that they were coming down on the coast.
Well, yeah, there is now it's called the Kelp Highway hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly.
Where they're taking watercraft and coming down. But anyway, this is the traditional hypothesis, Bering Land Bridge.
Actually, people ended up in Hawaii.
If we step back in time, 140,000 years ago, the penultimate glacial maximum, we had the same conditions. We have sea level below what it is today, and ice sheets in North America. We have the Bering Land Bridge in place but blocked. 120,000 years ago, interglacial maximum, sea level higher than today. Bering Straits in place, separating Alaska from Russia. But then there's the sweet spot at 130,000 years ago when the land bridge is open. and dispersal ground is open. So we say if it can happen at 13 or 14,000 years ago, it could also happen at 130,000. And coincidentally, American lion, bison, and woolly mammoths are thought to have dispersed into North America at the same time. So if you're hungry, maybe not this, but follow the herd, right? So,
Chase that poor guy all the way to San Diego.
so anyway, we have an exhibit at the museum that's been up actually since 2017 on the Cerutti Mastodon site. It's on the second floor of the museum. Here's the tusk here. And then various cases kind of trying to tell the story. It's a difficult story to tell in a static exhibit like this. It's easier to tell it like this and have a conversation about it. So, and there's Richard. So anyway, thank you. We can answer some more questions.
In summary, I mean, it sounds like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you're convinced what you've seen was in fact created by humans. Is it also safe to say that whoever did it, you think just died out and they went nowhere, which might explain why there's not additional evidence, and then maybe 100,000 years later, someone else makes the attempt?
Yeah, I mean, we think it was, a failed dispersal. It happened at Jamestown. But I mean, it happens.
Yeah.
All sorts of things happen. I would suspect there are other sites. We just haven't found them.
Yeah.
It's difficult to find sites like this, obviously. And we were in the right place at the right time. We had Richard on the ground.
Build more freeways.
How much money did they give you?
Oh, that's a good question. We excavated that site 5 months. So
And then you had to leave?
we took, they were like, but I mean, fortunately, it was really out of the way of the construction. We continued to monitor. I didn't mention that in that 6 meters of strata, we collected direwolf, camels, capybara, horse. Did I mention direwolf? And lots of rodents, but a lot of ice age, ground sloth. So I mean, it was full of Pleistocene critters, even some lands.
Just as a comment, Martin, you were saying that it's a long distance from Alaska to Chile, but it's also a very long distance from Africa to Alaska if you're going by land. So these are tough. Yeah,
but out of Africa, again, I'm not an archaeologist, I should read more about it, but the dispersal of hominins out of Africa occurred really early. So when you think of Homo erectus, it's in Asia, early.
I was just meant they were very hungry.
Oh yes, very hungry. It's an interesting story. We are a curious group of organisms, humans, or hominins in general. So it's not surprising that people would venture into this open habitat early on. I just wish we could have conversations about this that weren't based on the fact that it's too old.